I'm lost. Okay, main speaker. Our main speaker tonight is the handsome Bob.
Hi everybody, I'm Bob, an alcoholic. I'm dressed a little differently than a lot of you here tonight, but since we all speak the language of the heart, I think I'm in the right place. Thank you, John, for inviting me. Congratulations to all the birthdays, and Michael in particular, a good friend. I sobered up in the San Fernando Valley. About 15 years ago, I moved out to Ventura County. I live in Oxnard, but yeah, I know. Some refer to Oxnard as Bakersfield by the sea. So but I live about 6 houses up from the Pacific Ocean, so it's not bad. Anyway, I started looking for meetings out there, and I had trouble finding them. I finally found a good meeting on a Friday night from 8 to 9, book study. And one night I got out of there after I'd been there 2 or 3 weeks, and turned right down to Channel Islands Boulevard and turned right to go home. And I felt a little claustrophobic. And then I saw the cones changing 2 lanes into 1. Then I saw the sign that said, "License and sobriety check ahead." I don't know about you, but I never got caught in a sobriety check when I was drinking. I have, however, taken sharp right turns up over the curb and driven off through some guy's backyard. And on one occasion, I got out of the car and walked off into the woods and left it running and picked it up at the impound lot 2 days later. But I didn't get a 502 or a DUI because of it. Anyway, I inched forward to these 3 police persons, 2 women and a man, and the man had one of those long flashlights and he aimed it at me, and I handed him my license and registration, and first thing he said was, "How long since you had a drink?" I said, "January 24th, 1967. The 3 of them looked at each other and started to laugh, and they handed me the license and registration back and said, "Have a good evening." And I did. In fact, the next thing I tell you will tell you more about me than maybe anything else I say tonight. When I came to AA, some guy told me with us alcoholics, anything worth doing is worth doing to excess. The next night, I snuck out of the house and drove all over Ventura County trying to get caught in another sobriety check. So when you have a good feeling, you want to replicate it. Shortly after that, I was at a meeting one night, and not many people knew me out there, and so I was at a meeting, and this newcomer standing beside me, and I guess he's trying to make conversation, and he said, "Where'd you go for treatment?" And I thought, and I said, "I went to jail." You know, when I came to AA, there weren't any treatment places. There was 2 places we knew about. One was up in North Hollywood. It was called St. Ern's, and it was called Shire's Dryer. And they'd lock you up in there for 72 hours, and then they had to let you go. They'd dry you out. And the other one was down by LAX, and it was called St. Ern's, and it was owned by a Jewish guy named Stearns, and he couldn't get any customers, so he put a period after the ST, and he called it St. Ern's, and sent flyers out to all the Catholic parishes, and these dumb priests filled it up for the next 25 years with Irish alcoholics. So, tell you what we knew. I came to AA, I was born in Detroit, raised in Massachusetts, and it was the dream of every Irish Catholic family in New England to send their son to Notre Dame. And so I was the son that got to go to Notre Dame. And I grew up, and I was, neither of my parents were alcoholics. My brother and my sister weren't alcoholics, but the first drink I ever took, it became obvious to me that something changed, and it appeared that something changed for the better, because it got rid of all my inhibitions, and I remember when I was 15 years old, this friend of mine said, let's go get a couple of quarts of beer and go to the park. Baseball practice got canceled. So I remember how I felt. I bit my fingernails, I stuttered, I wore glasses, I was really insecure around girls. And I drank those 2 quarts of beer and everything changed. It changed forever. It was a permanent change. And I knew that I'd found a solution to all my insecurities. If you had looked at me or talked to me, you didn't notice how insecure I felt, but I really did feel insecure. But I get a little ahead of myself. I was a pretty good kid when I was being raised. I was an altar boy and a Boy Scout and a good athlete and a good student, a really good student. And I went to a Catholic boys' high school, and right away I started feeling less than. And I felt less than for the next 40 years, as far as that high school was concerned, because they sat us alphabetically, and they sat us in the same row for 4 years. And my row had O'Malley, Peterson, Regan, Shields, and Smith, 5 of us. And the other guy seemed so much smarter than I was, and I felt like a dumbbell. I got good grades, but I had to study really hard, and I never did measure up academically to those guys. And I didn't even want to go to my high school reunions because I knew I'd see them and I knew they'd treat me like crap. And so anyway, I finally went to my 40th high school reunion, and I found out why I felt so inferior. It's because I was. O'Malley turned out to be Peter O'Malley, who was the chief counsel of the National Football League. Peterson was Gordon Peterson, the Tom Brokaw of CBS News for the last 35 years in Washington, D.C. Regan sells glue machines in Oxnard. It's not that funny, lady. Shields was Jack Shields, the CFO of Chief Financial Officer of Digital, the big computer company. And Smitty was Jack Smith, who was the CEO of General Motors before it went bad. So anyway, I went to my 40th high school reunion, and I guess they forgot to treat me badly. And I went to my 50th high school reunion, and it was a lot of fun. And but anyway, I got out of college. I was accepted at most of the colleges, all but one. And I went to Notre Dame, and I remember going out there on a train. I got drunk on the train riding out there, and one of my best friends was a guy named Warren Baker. And we became fast friends, and we played sports for 2 years, and we hung out. We're in the same dormitory. And then he followed an academic route, and I followed an alcoholic route, and we both graduated, and he went on his way. And I followed his progress for the next 23 years, and he did really well, and I just, didn't do as well. In the early 80s, I got a panel to the prison up in San Luis Obispo, and we'd go up there every month, and or every other month, and we take a group up, and we put on the meeting for the maximum security prison. And about the 3rd time I was up there, I told a story about Warren Baker, and he and I going out to Notre Dame, and how we were such good friends, and we went our separate ways, and I hadn't seen him in 22 years. And I said, what's ironic was, we're just a few miles apart tonight when I was in the prison. And I said, he's the president of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and I'm leading the meeting at the maximum security prison in San Luis Obispo, and I wouldn't trade places with him for $1 million. And he's not an alcoholic, but that's what Alcoholics Anonymous has done for me. I was rudderless when I got here. My sponsor for 15 years in AA was Chuck C. And I was on the retreat in 1974 or 5, whatever year it was, where he made the tapes, which later became the book, A New Pair of Glasses. So I knew him pretty well. But without getting ahead of myself too much, I finally was able, the last 3 years of my tour at Notre Dame was not very productive, and I shamed myself and my family, and didn't do well at all. But I graduated. Every time the heat got on, I'd sober up and study and pass, and anyway, I graduated. When I graduated from college, I was about to get drafted in the Army, and I made an intellectual decision to join the Navy instead. And so the decision was based on 3 billboards that said, join the Navy and see the world. One of them showed Hawaii, the other showed the Caribbean, and the third one showed the Mediterranean. And I just did rather do one of those than go in the Army. So it seemed like I had this guardian angel that led me through the maze of life up until that point. And anyway, I went to OCS and I graduated because I locked me up and I couldn't get at alcohol. So I graduated. They commissioned me an officer and a gentleman, and I remained an officer for the next 4.5 years. Remained a gentleman for almost 24 hours. And when I was 9 days, 9 days after I was commissioned, I was up for court-martial as an officer. So, and like I said, my luck seemed to be turning. My first set of orders weren't to Hawaii, the Caribbean, or the Mediterranean. They were to Kodiak, Alaska. So I went out and bought these Alaskan uniforms, and the day I got them back from the tailor, I got a change of orders. I was going to Asmara, Eritrea, Ethiopia, a few hundred miles north of the equator in Africa. So I took my Alaskan uniforms, went to Africa for the next 1.5 years, and was in continuous trouble because of my drinking, all because of my drinking. But every time the heat really got on, I'd sober up and I'd do her job and his job and their job, and I was like a poster boy for the Navy for 2 or 3 weeks, and then the heat would go off and I'd start drinking again, and you know the rest of the story. I got an honor. After 1.5 years there, I was transferred back to the Pentagon, and I was in the Pentagon during a real tense period, including the time that President Kennedy was shot. I was on duty in the Chief of Naval Operations Communications Office, so I was a hazard that fortunately nothing bad happened when I was on duty that I can remember. I was also a blackout drinker. I went to my first AA meeting when I was 19 years old. I was looking through the South Bend Tribune one night, and they had an ad one day, and they had an ad. It said Alcoholics Anonymous, had a phone number. So I said, it's a joke. I said, I'll call the number. So I called the number, and they got this answering service, and they put me in touch with this guy, and although my name was John, I didn't want him to, I figured they'd track down all the Bobs if I told them my real name. So I told the guy I was a transient from Detroit, and he said, you want to go to a meeting? I said, yeah. He said, I'll meet you at the bus station, and big bus station downtown South Bend. So he said, how will I recognize you? I made up this outfit, a brown coat and a red shirt and a red hat. It was May in South Bend. It was about 90 degrees and 90% humidity, and so the only red shirt and red hat I could find was a red wool check hunting shirt and a matching red hat with ear flaps on it. So I went down to the bus station, the South Shore station. The guy walked in the place and he looked around. He picked me. There's 80 people in the thing. He picked me right out and said, you come with me, and took me to the meeting. And what I do remember is at the end of the meeting, they gave me the 20 questions. I answered 19 of the 20 yes, and I was 19 years old. And I went back to the dormitory, and my friends all flunked it, but not with as high a grade as I had. And so I had to rationalize, this must be a recruiting tool to build up your membership. So I went back out and drank for 9 more years. And it was a tough time, Vin Scully used to say they brought him in on his shield, and that's pretty much how I arrived here. Chuck C. used to say when he got to Alcoholics Anonymous, the bottle had beat him to death, and he'd run out of his own resources. And that's how I arrived. I couldn't have gone on any longer. Somebody asked me how much money I had when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. I said if I'd had $20 more, I'd have a different sobriety date or no sobriety date at all. It was over. And so I finally got out of the Navy. So my friends said, you ought to settle down, get married, you won't drink so much. So a month later, I got married and drank more. She left me no less than 40 times in the first year we were married. And finally, I was fired from 3 jobs, transferred out here to Southern California. I drank in Southern California for a year and a half. I drove the freeways in a blackout during that time, an average of 4 nights a week. And that has some significance because for the last 42 and a half years, I've average 4 meetings a week in Alcoholics Anonymous. And so it's no wonder, those are when I've known a lot of people over this time who have come to AA for a while and gone back out and drank, and almost every time you'll talk to them and say, what happened? What drove you off? So, well, I really didn't go to as many meetings as I used to, but that wasn't the reason. Well, it seems like it's a common denominator among most of the people that are here for a while and go back out. So I know, being a shanty Irishman of limited intelligence, that I know that if I keep going to meetings, it's going to increase my odds of staying here. And it also, it's improved every area of my life. In January 1967, I couldn't go any further. I got a hold of this priest in Malibu at the Sarah Retreat. He put me in touch with a woman in AA, and she took me to my first meeting, a Tuesday night at Arlington group over in LA. And I didn't go to another meeting for another week, but I didn't drink. And the next Tuesday night I went back, and Norm Alpe was the speaker. And if you're ever having a bad day and you think you might need medication, listen to a Norm Alpe tape first, and maybe you don't. But he was the most amazing, most fun speaker in AA that I ever heard, and a lot of us feel the same way. I got involved in AA when I was 10 days sober. They suckered me into going on a couples retreat in Palos Verdes. I lived up in the valley, and so I met some people that said, come to our Friday night meeting. So I said, okay. So I went to their Friday night meeting, and there was this old alcoholic priest. I used to call him old. He was 4 years younger than I am now. But he shuffled along, and he smoked a pipe, and he was always having newcomers drive him around. He'd had a series of strokes. His name was Father Ted. And as soon as he met me, he said, I need a ride home. So I said, I'll give you a ride home. I got my repossessed car back. So I drove him home and dropped him off. He said, I need a ride to Burbank at noon tomorrow. So I took him to Burbank. He said, I want to talk to you in my room tonight. And so I went and saw him. Back to Burbank the next day. I took him to 17 meetings in 14 days. And something magical happened. I'd become a celebrity in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was Father Ted's driver. And we'd go walk into a meeting, they'd have a seat for him and a seat for me. And we did this for 2 weeks. And I was really, as my southern friend said, in high cotton in AA. And after the 14th day, I dropped him off. I said, same time tomorrow, Father? He says, no. He says, I got another ride. I thought, you ungrateful old goat, Here I'd saved his life for 2 weeks, and that next night I was sitting at home, and my wife at the time was pacing, and she said, are you going to the meeting? I said, no, because he's going to be there with his new ride. And so it didn't seem quite that funny to me at the time. But anyway, finally at 20 after 8, I couldn't take it anymore. I got in the car and drove to the meeting, walked in. There's Father Ted sitting in my seat, and the new ride sitting Father Ted sitting in his seat, his new ride sitting in my seat. And I walked over to into the shadows there, and 3 old-timers, been sober 9, 10, 11 months, standing there. And before I could open my mouth, they said, he did it to you too, huh? So, 15 years later at Father Ted's memorial, there was like 500 former Father Ted drivers that showed up to tell all the stories, and we couldn't all get up and speak at the funeral or memorial, so we went out in the parking lot and we talked afterwards until they threw us out of there about 11 o'clock or midnight, and then we all went to Denny's, and they stayed there until 2 o'clock, and they threw us all out. And that's what we used to do when we came to AA. You go after a meeting, you stay up talking till 2 o'clock in the morning, you go home and sleep for 4 hours, get up at 6 o'clock and go to work. But it was a good life, and it was when I was sober 6 months, they got me involved in the inner group, answering phones at central office. When I was sober a year, they got me in general service, and I was a general's GSR and later a district committee member, and later the treasurer of the General Service Assembly. I got totally active in AA. It was Chuck C. and his predecessor as a sponsor, Warren S., a different Warren, and they were all service-oriented. So then later on, I got working on conventions, and I worked on AA conventions for 30 years or more. And so I've started meetings, and I've closed meetings, and Alcoholics Anonymous has just been part of my life. I can tell you quickly of my business success story. That was it. I got fired the day before I came to AA. I got a job. I kept it for a year and got fired. And I got another job, kept it for 9 months and got fired. And got another job when I was 22 months sober and kept it for 5 years and got fired. And here I am, 7 years sober, been fired from 3 jobs in sobriety. I'm really humiliated and sick of this. And I said, screw this. I went out and started my own business. I've been fired in 35 years. And so, an interesting thing happened in work too, because we had this recession that started about a year ago, and after 3 or 4 months, after a couple of months, I called my employees together. I got 15 people that work for me, and I called them together and I said, I want you to know that, I'm 70 years old at the time, but I want you to know that I really appreciate all the work you do, and I want to tell you what I'm going to do for you. First of all, I'm not going to lay anybody off. Secondly, you're not going to lose your benefits, your health insurance or your 401ks. And to prove my intention in this, I'm going to go out and start calling on the biggest customers that we have and to help support your jobs and your families. And nobody said much, and I just took it for granted. I just wanted them to know that. I've got loyal, good employees. A couple of months later, I was back at one of my suppliers in Nashville, and one of the men there that I've known for 20 years, but not well, and I didn't know he was a religious guy or anything, he said, how's your business? And so I told him the same story I just told you. And he looked at me, and he was quiet, and he said, the Lord will bless your business. And I had nothing to say. Finally I said, I guess you're right, John, I guess he has. And it's amazing what we do, what we learn, how we pick up these feelings for other people by just being around and being involved and practicing the principles and the steps in our lives. When I was sober, my oldest daughter was born 16 days before I sobered up, so she never saw me drink. And then 5.5 years later, my youngest daughter, Kathy, was born, and she was they were both the apples of my eye. They really, if you'd ask me today or any time, what's been my vocation for the last 42 years, I wouldn't say it's an AA member or a businessman or anything. I'd say my vocation has been a father. And now it's becoming a grandfather too, because what's really amazing is, now I barely met my grandfather. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, he died. And he lived in Massachusetts, we lived in Detroit, so I hardly ever met him but 1 or 2 times. And now my grandchildren get to spend an abundant amount of time with me. And I do things. Last week, I have a grandson who has a learning disability, and he has trouble getting along with other kids sometimes. And so but now he's on a swim club. And they said, well, we can't move Jackson up to the next level because he can't do a flip turn. So I said, let me take him tonight. So I went out and bought him he's afraid to get water in his nose. And I went and bought him a nose clip, and I took him up to the country club, and I said, okay, we're going to learn how to do flip turns tonight. I'm going to show you how. So we stayed there about an hour and a half, and when we came out of that pool, he could do flip turns. And my daughter was so proud, she put us both on Facebook the next day. So anyway, getting ahead of myself, getting turned around. As I mentioned, I sponsor a lot of guys out in Ventura. Well, they're all over the place now. Some are in here, some in Texas. They're all over the place. I moved out to Ventura County. I found a meeting that I liked. By the way, I have a home group, and I have a sponsor who's sober longer than me, and I go to a lot of meetings, as I said before, and I sponsor a bunch of guys. But I went to this meeting on the Navy base of all places because I was not an illuminated Navy officer. I was always ashamed of my naval career, and so if you can call it that. Anyway, it turns out my home group's on a Navy base out in Port Hueneme, and it's on Saturday at noon. It's called the It's For You group. Used to be easy to get into, but since 9/11, it's more difficult. we've got about 25 people, and they usually have 400 to 500 years of sobriety. And that includes a couple of, that's adding them all up. We always have a couple of people that are 90 days sober, 30 days sober, and so it's a good mixture, but it's heavily weighted on the long-term sobriety. But when I got out there, I met the people, and they had this young sailor that was probably in his mid-20s, and he fancied himself a ladies' man, and he had just gotten court-martialed. And so being from the Northeast, I gave everybody nicknames. That's what they did to us when we were growing up. So I nicknamed him Three Girlfriend John. And everybody thought it was funny. And within the next 6 months, 2 of the 3 girlfriends came to the meeting, heard about the nickname, and so for the last 12 years, he's been known as One Dog John. So another guy is and the funny thing, when I was in the Navy in Ethiopia, I had 6 chiefs, Navy chiefs that worked for me, and they all hated me. I can say that, no question, they all hated me. And now I sponsor 7 chiefs, retired chiefs, and they all hate, I joke that they all hate me too, just like the others. But this other's one retired Navy chief, name is Jimmy Mack, and all the women love him. He's a little bald-headed guy, and he cries all the time, and they all hug him. And I sponsor these 2 other guys, Leroy and Bubba, from Texas and Mississippi, that got a can of tobacco in their back pocket, and they get mad, and I get jealous when all the women go up and hug Jimmy Mack. And so, but then he cries. Many of you watching a commercial, and he starts crying. So one day I said, if Weepin' Willie over there had quit crying so much. So Jimmy Mack became Weepin' Willie. And so we got Weepin' Willie and Leroy and Bubba, whose names are really Dave and Choice. And we got a whole bunch of them there. So we had a good group. And life has been good in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to tell you a couple of little stories here, and I don't want to run out of time. So when I was about, first of all, my daughters were just my whole life. I just loved them so much. Did everything with them. I coached their soccer teams, coached their softball teams. I worked with on their homework. They'd have a PTA meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon someday, and there'd be 27 mothers and me show up for the PTA meeting, or what are they called, a meeting, teachers meeting. And I just loved being a part of their lives. And I coached them, and they loved being coached, and we just had a ball. However, after 12 years of sobriety, for a couple of years, my marriage had been going bad, and my wife at the time was interested in following some other spiritual pursuits, and she wasn't home much. And I was willing to live that way, but it just got to a point where Chuck C. said, "It's time for you to go." And it broke my heart, because I moved out like a thief in the night. I loaded my station wagon and drove over this other house that I owned, that I lived in before, and I just cried all weekend. It was so sad. I had heard of these fathers that would get divorced, and they'd see their kids for a few months, and then they'd meet somebody new, and then they wouldn't be as involved in their kids' lives, and I knew I couldn't do that. So finally, their mother said to me, we should have joint custody, but since they're both girls, she should be the main custodial parent, and they decide when I could see them, or something like that. And everything in me wanted to fight, and I said, something in AA, that spiritual training or something, said to me, you got to surrender this. And I said, you go ahead and take them, and whenever it's okay with them and it's okay with you, they're welcome to come to stay with me. And I didn't. That's as far as I pushed it. And well, the little one, Kathy, took every opportunity she could to stay with me. She was there all the time. I mean, 2 or 3 nights a week, she'd have softball or soccer practice, and she'd want to spend the night, and I'd take her to school the next day. And every weekend, it seemed, she was over at my house, and it was okay with me. And Lynn, pretty much the same way. And it was okay. Even though I was divorced, I was sad and lonely. It was okay, because they were in my life. And about a year before I got divorced, I decided I'd go down to the local high school and jog a quarter of a mile. I didn't know how far. So I went down and I jogged a quarter of a mile around the track, 1 lap. And I was exhausted, and I went home. And So I went back and the next night and I jogged another quarter of a mile, and I was tired again. Within a couple of weeks, I could run 1.5 miles. To make a long story short, when I was 11 months after I took my first step in 1978 or 9, whatever it was, 1979, I was lined up for the Hang 10 Marathon over in Griffith Park. And I'd only run half that far before, but I was grieving this loss that was upcoming, the loss of the marriage, the fear that I wouldn't have a relationship with my daughters. And so anyway, I lined up there, and I only told 2 people that I was going to run it because I didn't want to be humiliated if I failed. So I went out, and I'd only run 13 miles prior to that. It's the longest run I'd had. So I started to run the race, and I got out to 13 miles, and I felt pretty good. And got out to 15.5 miles, and I saw my car for the last time, and I was just breezing along. I got to 20 miles, and I had this little smirk on my face. I'm thinking, I'd heard these people hit the wall at 20 miles, and I'm thinking they must be lesser beings or something. And all of a sudden, I'm running along, and my arm flies up in the air, and I look over, and it's back down here, and all of a sudden, I felt like Mr. Potato Head, like all my body parts are falling off at the same time, and I couldn't hold myself together, and so I slowed down somewhat, and I said, I got 6 miles to go. So I started running the best I can to get to the end of this thing, and I continued on because I just determined that I had to do something. I had to do this for myself, and so I got right towards the finish line, and I was really hurting, and they string these plastic flags the last 200 yards before the finish line, and you run down this long chute, and friends and relatives stand on either side, and they applaud your effort. And I got up to that point. I didn't have any friends there, or relatives, so I straightened up. I wanted to look as good as I could, so I started running down there, and people started cheering and clapping, and then they start screaming and yelling. And this one guy says, "Here comes a woman." And I look over my shoulder, and this long-legged woman is bearing down on me. I hadn't seen a woman in 45 minutes. All my macho came back. I said, no way I'm letting her pass me. So I started running like hell, and she ran right up on my shoulder and said, Bob Regan, Bob Regan. And I looked, and it was June G., she was 19 years old. She'd already been sober 6 years in AA. And first thing I said to her was, why do you wait 26 miles to humiliate me in front of all these people? She said, I didn't run the race. I just saw you go by, so I jumped over the flag so I could run in with you. A few months later, I'd signed up and was going to run the New York City Marathon. And what reminded me of that the other day, I spoke Sunday night in Santa Clarita. And last Sunday, they ran the New York City Marathon, and it was the 30th anniversary of the New York City Marathon that I ran. A couple of nights before I was going back to run that marathon, Kathy was over there. She was 7 years old at the time, and she was over spending the night, and she went in and watched TV while I was washing the dishes about 6:30. The last 5 minutes of the news, they had that human interest segment. And I could hear Tom Brokaw, or whoever it was, talking about this man in New York, ran his first marathon, and all of his family were there. And just as he passed the finish line, he had a heart attack and died. And I'm hoping she didn't hear it. She's sitting right in front of it, and she didn't say a word the rest of the night. And so I put her to bed about 9:30, and she hadn't said much, hardly at all. And she said, Daddy, do you think you're going to die when you run that New York Marathon? I said, Kathy, I don't think so. I've trained pretty hard, and you probably don't have anything to worry about. And she said, well, you don't have to worry, because I'm not going to let them bury you. I'm going to keep you in my closet. So, people have told me for 42 and a half years, maybe 71 years, that they love me, but nobody told me more eloquently than Kathy did when she was 7. Now my grandchildren are the light of my life. You heard about Jackson. Molly she's 9 years old, and she's a model and an actress and a softball player and the whole bunch. She's just full of energy, and she's a little beauty. And she goes up to the club with me, and she goes to camp there, and then she plays tennis, and we swim and do all these things. And whenever it's towards the end of the day, she tries to coerce me into taking her into the club for dinner. And so a couple of months ago, I took her in, and we sat down, and the waitress came up and saw Molly sitting there. She took her wine glass, and I said, "You can take mine too." And Molly looked up at the waitress and said, "He's an AA." I thought, touches my heart, you know? It really... In any case, you know, I said when we started that we speak the language of the heart, and I really enjoyed your birthdays. I enjoy the energy, the electricity in your meeting, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to come here tonight and give Michael his cake and just be a part and parcel, and in the midst of Alcoholics Anonymous. I will keep you all in my closet. God bless you.